And hello and welcome to this live question and answer session with a keynote speaker for our online conference on the topic of thinking about thinking. My name is Paul Ellis and I'm Head of Teaching and Learning at Cambridge International. We are delighted to be joined by the presenter of the keynote that you've already had the opportunity to view. She is Iroise Dumontheil, who is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience in the Department of Psychological Sciences, Birkbeck College, University of London, and a member of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience.
Hello.
Hi Iroise, welcome along. Her research focuses on the typical development of social cognition and cognitive control during adolescence and their functioning in adulthood. As you would have heard in her keynote, her studies combine a variety of methods to look at brain and cognitive development, including functional and structural neuroimaging, cognitive and behavioural assessments, and genetics. She is interested in the impact of cognitive training, from computerized games to mindfulness meditation practice, on child and adolescent cognition, as well as the potential implications of these various research strands for education. In the first half of this 45-minute session, I'm going to be asking Iroise some questions to underline and expand on some of the key themes she talked about in her presentation. While I'm doing so, we'd like to encourage you to interact using the Q&A function on Zoom to give your comments and opinions, and above all, to send us your questions that we can ask on your behalf in the second half of this session. You can indicate that you like someone else's question, and we will ask Iroise the questions that are the most popular. As ever, please keep your questions specific to today's topic and general enough to be of interest to everyone who is watching. And welcome to everybody who's already saying hello to us on there. Thank you for joining in. Our theme is thinking about thinking. Our brains continue to develop as we transition from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and with it, our capacity to think about how and why we do things, take risks, and control our behaviours. How we work with students in schools is fundamental to their future outcomes. With our support, they can form habits and attitudes to learning, an ability to self-regulate and to know what to do when they don't know what to do. In this session, we are going to ask Iroise more about her work and about the practical applications of research about cognition in education. So welcome again, Iroise. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for doing the keynote for us as well, which we very much enjoyed. If I may, I'd like to start with one or two personal questions about how you got into the research you're doing. And I was wondering if you could tell us initially how you became interested in the field of neuroscience and cognition and then its application within education.
Yes, well, thank you for having me and inviting me to give the keynote. I'm impressed to see people from so many different countries. So I was interested in the brain, partly to understand how it works in general from quite a while ago at the end of my university degree. And so I went into this field of cognitive neuroscience, but I never wanted to be a medical doctor, and I wasn't really interested in disorders specifically. And education and the field of educational neuroscience is quite new and is a way to try to find application outside of the more clinical field, application of our cognitive neuroscience research for kind of a broader population. So that's what got me interested in this.
Brilliant, thank you. And would you say the schools are really quite interesting in engaging this area now? Would you say there's increased interest in what you're doing?
I think there is, but there's a big issue, at least in the UK where I'm based, in that teachers don't have much time. And so although they might be interested, they don't really have time to learn or to do training or to even take part in our research projects. That can be kind of really big constraint, sometimes a hurdle in trying to get our research going. So I think there's a lot of interest, but how really to make sure we have time to engage with teachers, and they have time for us. I think that is a big constraint.
I think that's very true, and that's one of the reasons actually why we run sessions like this, to help teachers engage a bit more with some of the ideas in the hope that they can then pick up some of them in a sense of condensed manner, so they can then understand a bit more that might then be useful for putting into practice thereafter as well. So I was wondering, what have been some of the light bulb moments so far in your research?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think there's many of those eureka moments. I think that's something people maybe get a misleading impression from outside, and research is very incremental. So we kind of do small studies, small steps where gradually discover more and more in combination with others. And I think that's really, so I wouldn't say really I've got this kind of magic, like very sudden light bulb moments, but like, or my understanding has changed. So yeah, I'm going to kind of avoid that question, I think.
That's absolutely fine. So let's have a look at your presentation now, and I was thinking we could go through each section in turn and just elaborate a bit more perhaps on some of the sections, and help some of our viewers and listeners as well to understand a bit more about some of the concepts. So in the first part of your presentation, you explained how our brains develop, and I was wondering if in brief you could tell us why it is that we get better at some things during adolescence but actually less good at some other things. What is it about our brain development that makes this be the case?
Yeah, so I don't know whether we really get worse at some things, but I guess the key thing is the studies from cognitive neuroscience research in adolescents have shown is that during adolescence, there's a time where certain parts of the brain are maturing and sensitive to hormonal changes. And that might drive adolescents' interest towards their peers and the social context and social rewards. And so it's not like they're kind of worse at it, but it's that their behavior is influenced much more than children and adults' behavior by the social context and whether they are with their peers. And that means they will be less, potentially in terms of education, less focused on sort of more academic performance, less focused on pleasing their parents, but much more interested in doing things and possibly engaging in risky behavior to impress their peers. And so I think that's really something quite important. And this is thought to be driven by changes in kind of deeper regions in the brain, subcortical regions, while there's more prolonged changes into the early 20s in those regions of the prefrontal cortex, which is just behind the forehead, and that enables you to maybe control your behavior more and kind of take more time thinking about the consequences of your actions.
Thank you. And is that related in any way to how brains were developed historically? So if we look back at our ancestors thousands of years ago, for example, are there certain parts of the brain that developed before other parts did? And is that having an impact on our ability to develop as adolescents as well?
So we can't really tell that, right, from brains, from like skulls that we might find from ancestors. But what you can think of is when we think about adolescence as a period of like risk-taking or maybe kind of negative aspects of adolescence. Really, if you put this in a broader evolutionary context, adolescence is the time where you have to leave your family, find a mate, and maybe go to a different group. And so if you're risk averse, you'll stay at home with your parents, you might not achieve and you might not then be successful in having children and reproducing. So actually risk-taking and maybe not thinking too much about the consequences of your actions and maybe being more exploratory, liking to explore things, might have been selected for during evolution as something important for adolescents to do, like so they can be have the kind of courage to be interested in their peers and then leave home and take these risks. So I think that's quite important. So really it means that we've got this period of increasing independence, exploration, and associated learning, because you need to learn how to, do all this by yourself. And so we've got this prolonged period of being able to learn things and adapt to your environment.
I see. So to what extent would it be fair to say that some risk-taking becomes less as people become more settled in their lives, as they settle down with a mate, as you say, and then they perhaps feel they've got what we might refer to as the hygiene factors in place, where they feel secure and safe, and then they've got a stable lifestyle? Is that part of us becoming less into taking risks as we become older?
Yeah, so as for everything, there are individual differences. So there might still be people in their 40s who want to try parachuting and things like that. But really overall, and that where we have most data is for car accidents. So for example, you're not allowed very often to rent a car without a big premium if you're under 25. And that's because the data suggests there's a lot more accidents in youths, like in the early 20s. Importantly, though, it's not necessarily just when they're by themselves. So it's, again, this social context that seems to be driving differences in evaluation of risk and differences in behavior. So you want to look cool, maybe in front of your peers, and if they're in your car, and so you're going to go a bit faster, maybe like skip or jump a red light, and you might end up in a crash. And there are countries, I believe maybe Canada, someone might confirm if they're from Canada, where they're trying to put like forwards special insurances for youths, where if they have to promise to never have another youth in their car, only adults, and then they have to pay less insurance, because that's not the type of situations where they would end up in the same amount of kind of taking risk and having accidents. So really, I think that's one of the data we've got suggesting that there's more risk-taking and sensation-seeking in sort of adolescence and early adulthood compared to later on.
And that's interesting then also from the context of when we as teachers want students to take risks with, for example, their writing or their experimentation, or to be innovative as well. So perhaps adolescence is a good time to take risks, while at the same time we're trying to say to them, actually, as you mature, you might take less risks anyway. So it's a bit of a hard balance in some ways.
Yeah, it's a hard balance, but also we have teachers telling us, actually, that's not true. Our adolescents, they never raise their hand to say, take the risk of kind of giving the wrong answer. But the problem is that then the social risk is really kind of the risk of looking, giving the wrong answer or seeming too keen compared to their mates. That's more risky. So that's kind of, they're thinking about something else, not about the kind of daring to give an answer. But I think it is a very important question about how we can try and capitalize on this exploration and kind of risk in terms of, like, maybe more risky behavior within the social context. And sport, I think, is one example where you might be able to kind of push an adolescent, might be willing to go kind of a bit further and try out things in a kind of positive manner.
So I think we'll return a bit more to risky behaviour and the influence of peers later on in the questions. Before we get on to that, though, I'd like to ask you a couple more things. And one is, you referred to a moment ago, actually, is about to what extent adolescents develop in a similar way. And I know you talk about this in your presentation, that there are differences between girls and boys, for example, maybe also culturally, perhaps internationally as well, there might be differences in development. So I just wonder if you could tell us a bit more about to what extent we can say that all adolescents' brains develop in the same way. The answer, of course, is no, but can you tell us a bit more about why this is the case and what studies have shown?
So in terms of gender differences, one aspect is that the start of adolescence is defined by puberty, and puberty, these hormonal changes, physical changes, tend to happen earlier in girls and in boys. So we have this maybe 1.5 year, 2 years difference between girls and boys, which can be really visible at age 13 sometimes, when you see kind of boys and girls of really different stages of puberty and maturation. So that has an impact as a sort of group gender level. But you have girls who go through puberty late, boys that go through puberty early. So there's a lot still of individual differences. In terms of the brain, they are very kind of major changes that will be experienced by all. The exact rates will differ. So for example, there are studies finding that the increase and decrease in gray matter volume might be more pronounced in people who end up with a higher IQ than people with lower IQ, where there's maybe less creation of connections and less pruning of connections during development. So these kind of subtle changes. In disorders, there might also be some differences. So for example, for schizophrenia, which is one of the mental health disorders that emerge in late adolescence, early adulthood, there's maybe some evidence that there's more pruning, more removal of gray matter and connections in the frontal cortex during adolescence. So there are these individual differences, but the general pattern where you have kind of significant changes in the volume in subcortical regions, in frontal cortex regions, then all adolescents will be going through that, but the exact timing will be different.
Right, so it's important for our listeners to know that there's no such thing as an average, really, and that a lot of statistics, of course, tend to point towards the average, but in actual fact, there's such a wide margin in so many areas.
Well, really, there's an average, but there's a big deviation, and there's no like unique or typical or like standard thing. So there's a kind of big variation with overlap. but it's the case between boys and girls is one of those really obvious cases. For example, if you think about height, there is differences on average between men and women, but there's a lot of women who are bigger, taller than men, and vice versa.
So we couldn't say, for example, at the age of 14, a girl is suddenly going to become like this, because it absolutely doesn't happen.
No.
Brilliant, thank you. Moving on to cognitive control. So cognitive control is about being able to adapt one's behaviour through cognitive processes. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what studies have shown about adolescents' ability to engage appropriately with learning at different stages. And so how do the brains develop to enable them then to, for example, listen more carefully, or to think more about what they're writing or indeed simply doing in a classroom context?
So I think some of that, the main changes are going to be earlier. So it's more in preschool and primary school, where children really are trying to develop, or are being encouraged to develop, their ability to pay attention in a sustained way, not get distracted all the time, not interrupt each other, so control their own behavior so they don't just keep butting in. So that is kind of going to be earlier. During adolescence, there is going to be other aspects of, because adolescents are expected to be more independent. You're not going, for example, you go to school and you're going to have different subjects. You have to be in control of, bringing your books for the right subjects on the right day, going to the right classroom, and there's a lot more to manage. And so trying to kind of manage your time and what your homework, all this are really things that are kind of developing. And the ability, one other aspect is the ability, how much information you can keep in mind. So which is called working memory. So this kind of capacity to keep information in sort of a mental workspace for a short time. And that's important for a lot of things. That can be important in maths, for example. If you're doing calculation, you need to kind of keep different things in mind. Very young children might only be able to remember 2 or 3 things. Adolescents might start being able to remember 4 or 5 things, and some of them even more. And that is continuing to mature during adolescence. That might mean you can understand more abstract concepts, more complex sentences, like remember longer sentences, bigger instructions, and you're able to kind of cope with that better than when you're younger.
Great, thank you. You mentioned there as part of your answer about some younger children, so what we might refer to as early years as well. There's a question that's come in here from Cherry. Thank you, Cherry, for this. She says, can we really say that a newborn baby's brain is a tabula rasa? So in other words, a blank slate, I guess. And in your studies, what can you say about that? So I don't study newborn babies, but really what has been shown is they're not. For example, the children in the womb can already hear sound, and it's been found that they can recognize the sort of tonality and the rhythm of their native language already at birth. They can recognize their mom's voice compared to another mom's. If their mom always reads the same story, they can actually recognize sort of, or they react differently to that story that their mom always read to them compared to another story. So actually babies have already, it's not a blank state, they already have some knowledge and some effect from the environment. They will also be affected, for example, by the mother's stress that will affect their prenatal development. Everyone knows about smoking as well, alcohol. So all these will affect the development. So they're not completely blank states. They will already been affected by things, and they will, especially for the auditory kind of hearing, will already started being adapting to their native language. So interesting, isn't it? I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff. Thank you for that. You mentioned about anxiety there in mothers, and I just want to talk about something else to do with anxiety now as well. So I know that part of your studies talking about older students is to do with anxiety in maths and anxiety perhaps also in other related subjects such as science and things like that. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the work that you've done to help students counter anxiety. What have you seen in the studies so far, and how does cognitive control in a sense help students if they might be anxious about particular subjects? And maths, I think, is quite a common one, isn't it, that some people tend to get anxious about? Yeah, so I haven't actually done much direct research on this, but yes, people have been interested in maths anxiety, but test anxiety as well. And then there's more broadly the fact that during adolescence, there is an increase in anxiety as a sort of mental health problem.
a sort of kind of more clinical level of that. And that can also be related to this socio-emotional interactions and social context. So what can be done about it? I don't think there's a massive amount that's been done in terms of practically maths and test education. But there's attempt to try things like mindfulness and relaxation and see whether that may help adolescents, in particular with anxiety. There's a big trial called Myriad, which will be looking at mindfulness, effect of mindfulness training, school-based, so kind of whole universal, the whole school is taking part in these mindfulness training, and how that might potentially help adolescents, not necessarily to not be anxious at all, but maybe be aware of the anxiety, how it might emerge in their body, be reflected in their body, and maybe try to kind of move away and sort of not ruminate on it, and not kind of try to kind of basically approve it in a way, accept it, and then maybe that would have a bit less impact on their performance. But it is a big issue, there are, I believe, students who do well on kind of courseworks, and then but on the day of the exams and tests, they're really kind of affected. And that raises a question about, the importance. And I think there's people looking at that, the importance of GCSEs and how maybe it's causing too much stress and you're not really getting benefit from it in terms of, educational benefit of it.
Absolutely, thank you. One of our viewers here, Rosanna, thank you for your question, has picked up on one of the strategies that you mentioned in your talk, which is the stop and think way of looking at how to control how you do things. So literally, as it says, you stop and then you think about what you need to do next to be able to solve a problem or to participate in something. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, because Rosanna would like to know a little bit more about what you've done and what you've seen.
Yeah, so I mean, because cognitive control, the individual differences in cognitive control seem to be associated with academic achievement, people have been really interested to see whether you can train cognitive control. And it's been used through kind of various video games. You show you can, for example, increase working memory capacity and maybe some attention skills. The problem is that it doesn't seem to transfer, and showing kind of then these particular pupils showing better achievement in maths, for example. So maybe you can train on these type of games, similar games, but it doesn't necessarily transfer in maths. What we're trying to do in maths and science with this stop and think program is not necessarily train your inhibitory control, so you're like not blurting out a response immediately, not coming up with your first, maybe a bit more intuitive, incorrect answer, but trying to make children first realize that there are times where you shouldn't, like the first thing that comes to your mind might not be correct, which is quite already important. And that's something, going back to mindfulness, like realization that you can be in control a bit of your thoughts. That is this step of what we call metacognition, so awareness of your thoughts and your feelings. That is kind of an important step. But the other step is more strategy. So saying, in this context, maybe you should try and stop, not give an answer right away, and think about it. So the program enforced a few seconds where the children could not respond, so they had to kind of stop and think about it. And the idea is that gradually, if the teacher reinforces it, then the children might kind of gradually more automatically stop and think, and not immediately go and give an answer. So we're training not necessarily cognitive control, but using your cognitive control. So trying to kind of, in this context, in this case it was math and science, counterintuitive problems, trying to get children to not immediately give their first answer.
And this reminds me a little bit of an approach we use, which in assessment for learning, where we say to people, okay, pose a question if you're a teacher, but pause then before you're expecting answers, because so often people just either rush in with their answer, or indeed the teacher rushes in with giving the answer they're hoping that the students might come up with as well. So I wonder if some of our viewers might be thinking about that as you're mentioning the stop and think idea.
And that's also a question in terms of, if some tests are timed, you need to do as many questions as possible within given time. And actually maybe that's counterproductive, because in some cases you might want to enforce thinking about stuff first, thinking about your answer, not rushing. And only once something is mastered, then your automatic response at that point might become, be the correct one. But when you're still learning, and for particularly tricky concepts, maybe you don't want to encourage speed. You want to encourage kind of reflection.
Great, thank you. And okay, so I'm just going to have a look at some of these questions that are coming in here thick and fast now, which is great to see. There's a lot of interest, I think, in the risky side of things. So let's see if we can take a couple of those in. Okay, so somebody says, it's Uzma, thank you for your question, says, can you suggest a way to deal with risk taking in adolescence, when children are adolescents? How can you encourage people? I don't know, it says to deal with risk taking. I guess that could be positive and negative, couldn't it? So we've spoken about it a bit
Yeah,
already.
I mean, that's a big question, right? You know, the problem is that exploration, learning, trying new things is important, and is important for learning. And I believe even for younger children, there's some research, we talk about, you know, helicopter parents, and actually risk taking is important because that's how you understand what your limits are. You might be in a condition that it's a little bit scary, but you get over it, and that kind of trains you to realize you can get over scary situations. So actually, we don't want to kind of shelter and like prevent any risk taking, because it's probably useful in terms of learning. It's a process. Of course, you don't want people to, you know, die, in particular in car crashes and stuff. So I think that you just have to think really about, for example, more the social context again. So who is, you know, adolescent, who are they hanging out with, who are they influencing, the characters that might have a big influence, and you want to maybe foster influence from good examples rather than bad examples. So I think it's more in that case, and thinking about the social context and the relations between adolescents, how you might kind of foster particular aspect of risk. And I think, you know, well, in the UK, I can't remember what they call, but there's those awards for, you know, climbing mountains and doing things in nature, which are quite risk-taking, but they're viewed in a positive way. And I think, you know, can you channel things in a kind of positive risky maybe exploration, rather than sort of other aspects, more negative aspects.
Thank you. Nazia has asked an interesting question here, saying, would it be a good idea for adolescents to understand more about power and risk? So she says here to develop an awareness of their brain and its power to enable them to take more risks, or indeed to control the risks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've viewed it a little bit more on the flip side, and how making adolescents aware that their brain are quite reactive, sensitive to the social context, and reactive to emotions, maybe more than an adult brain. And then they might not necessarily have the kind of cognitive control skills to really turn that down, and avoid it driving their behavior. I think we believe that that might be important, and there's not. We tried to kind of put together a blade, which I mentioned in my keynote, to try and get adolescents to reflect on this, and kind of have but tell them about what's happening in their brain, and reflect on this. And maybe again, this metacognitive aspects, if they're not in that situation right at that point themselves, think about what they could do if suddenly they get really angry. They don't want to get in a fight in school because they might get expelled. What can they do? And think about strategies. And it could be, okay, well, I'll move away. You know, I'll go see another friend, or I'll go see the teacher. You know, whatever, some coming up with strategies, and so really reflecting about, you know, they might have this limit, they get really angry. What can they do about it? And coming up with strategies.
So a degree of role playing, and then talking about things with each other afterwards, and in a sense taking ownership of how much they might impact on other people in their behaviors, and did on themselves as well.
Yeah. And one aspect of this, which I didn't talk much about, in terms of perspective taking, like they might have less good perspective taking, so they might not realize that what they're doing might impact others or their parents. And again, kind of maybe adding a bit more insight, and in part about telling them about how their brain is changing, I think would be part of this whole trying to help them.
I guess there's certainly no harm in it anyway. To learn more about yourself is a good thing. In fact, one of the things that you say towards the end of your presentation is to say about how it's important for students also to think about their physical and their mental health. And I've seen elsewhere a lot of people these days now particularly talking about knowing your own body. If you know how your body reacts in certain ways, if you can see that when something is happening, there might be certain triggers that you can notice. And then if you've already realized that, and you know what to do in that kind of situation, then it can be quite helpful. So I was wondering what else else you might have seen around the importance of maintaining good physical and mental health, and essentially understanding your body. So if you have a healthy mind and a healthy body, they can work in tandem nicely with each other.
Well, so in terms of the body, there's different things. There's, the effect of potential stress, like chronic stress, and sleep in particular. So sleep is something that, everyone knows that during adolescence, your hormones are changing, and part of it means that they can't fall asleep early. Like they find it harder to fall asleep and then harder to wake up in the morning. So their body clock is a bit shifted. And now with technologies, there's a risk that not that technologies are intrinsically bad in themselves, but that they might go to bed later and they might kind of lack sleep, and that will have an effect on their body, but also on their mental health. So that's one aspect of things. But in terms of awareness of your body, I think that relaxation, mindfulness, these type of techniques are also part of this, but being aware and of how does it show when I'm anxious, oh, I've got a tummy ache, am I sick? Or actually that's anxiety showing up as a tummy ache. And then you can maybe realize what's going on, and maybe at that point try a 5-minute relaxation technique. And so if you have this awareness of how your emotions, feelings, and thoughts might have effects in your body, that might help you then, develop and apply strategies at different time points.
Great, thank you. Got an interesting question here from Patricia. Thank you for your question. She says, how can we help students with a very high IQ not to become so obsessed with perfection and details?
I don't know whether I've got any research to think about, any research that's really relevant to this. I mean, is it bad? I guess there's another thing about individual differences, right? So some people are interested there's some jobs where attention to details is very important, other jobs where it's less important. So I think it's more of an individual differences thing that, but it's maybe making them a bit more aware of time. So if you spend too much on details, then you might kind of run out of time for important things. So maybe this kind of relates to time management, and so kind of giving them a bit more tips and about what really matters and what matters less, because people might not know, whether spelling, is as important as something else, or the content, and for different assessments, different things might matter.
Some people talk about analysis paralysis. I don't know if you've come across that, where they say that some people just analyze things far too much and it actually stops them from getting going on something. And there's another researcher here at Cambridge who talks about just having a go at something, even if it might be completely, rubbish, as he sometimes says to begin with, just do it, just put something down on paper, because at least it gets you started, it gets you over that hurdle of not being too perfectionist right from the beginning. Yes, indeed, it can be useful later on, but at least to get yourself started is one good thing.
Yeah, although there's also, the literature on fixed and growth mindset, and there's a lot of debate about it still, but this idea that some people might have this fear of failure and they don't want to try things because they're worried they're going to fail at it, and they don't really want to have negative feedback, while other people's are very willing to try and fail and get feedback and then learn from it. And I think that's kind of relates a little bit to that, that you can, doesn't need to be perfect, you can learn from whatever you've done.
Absolutely, thank you. Yaya has asked a question here. She says, how can we help children that develop shyness in class?
So whether it's shyness towards a teacher, I mean, there's again this social context. So I've come across, and I think I mentioned maybe one of the references in my keynote, where it's say how loneliness and kind of the adolescents are learning how to interact with this quite complicated social cliques, network, identities, and how they fit in there, and trying to get schools to maybe foster acceptance and sort of helping and empathy, all these kind of aspects might actually help children or adolescents being socially happier. And I think it's not easy, but I think schools probably will play a role in fostering a good atmosphere for kind of the social interactions in their pupils.
So providing those opportunities again of people to be with each other, to do, such as you were suggesting with the play, and talking through what's going on and what they're thinking and how that might lead to them behaving in certain ways as well. And
also in terms of the values the school might have, right? Mm-hmm. Whether the school is going to value academic achievement, or is going to value helping each other and things like that, and kind of good social interactions, that is probably going to be important in fostering this aspect of adolescent development.
Absolutely. So a lot of co-curricular activities can help with that, but also in class, there's many opportunities to take time out and do that kind of thing too. Got a question here, because just very nice. There we go. Vinita has made a reference to lockdown and how some adolescents have not been able to meet up so regularly as they may previously have done. And so she's wondering how adolescents may have been affected due to the lack of being able to meet up with their peers. Have you seen any studies on that yet?
Yeah, I think so. Studies are kind of starting to come up. It's all so recent, but generally what it seems to have happened is actually maybe adolescents were in a less bad position than children, or sort of 8 to 10-year-old children, because adolescents already were using technology to communicate with each other, and already had these kind of strong social interactions online and through technology. And so they were able to kind of continue that when they were during lockdown, while younger children may not have been using these technologies and they were interacting with their friends at school, and suddenly they were completely cut off. So I think actually maybe adolescents did have this benefit. It's not, perfect, because they won't have been able to develop the same interactions they might have normally when you're kind of 15 to 18. So they start having partners and girlfriends and boyfriends, and that will kind of completely change things compared to outside of lockdown. So that will have been difficult. But I think adolescents will have benefited from already being quite good at kind of these sort of using these technologies. And otherwise, there is also some evidence that some adolescents might have benefited from not going to school, because some of them who were maybe bullied or were socially anxious actually were happier studying from home. So some subgroup of adolescents may have benefited from lockdown.
I think that's true. We ran a couple of sessions about that last year, where we were speculating that might well be the case with children who may otherwise feel disenfranchised in a sense when they're in the classroom, suddenly could be themselves from home. They wouldn't be distracted by others, for example, or they found it more easy to communicate through a screen rather than in a class, or in a sense have an avatar sometimes rather than to be themselves, and they could still perform in a very good way. In fact, even better if they could do that. So be interested to see more studies on that at some point. Okay, Paola has asked about when adolescents show strong opposition to people trying to help them, so teachers or parents trying to help them. How can we help students approach, I guess, others helping them in the correct way so that they can be helped? How can we get them around, in a sense, stopping themselves from getting the help that they perhaps actually do need?
I think that I find it quite tricky. I think I mentioned one of the book by clinical psychologists at the end there, and I think they do suggest some things about how to interact with adolescents, in particular when they're having problems. I think some of the suggestion is to say, you're there until they feel, that they can come, like repeatedly say, I'm there, when you need me, I'm there, and eventually they might come. But it's not easy, I think, to kind of go past that and make them, again, it's this idea of metacognition, and even in adults, right? It's like realizing that you might have a problem with something and then kind of seeking help. So a question about the use of rewards, which I think is quite interesting. So yeah, I think we're really at the beginning of that. There is one field of studies been looking at very specific population of children, adolescents with conduct disorder, where they might have kind of bad behavior, truancy and things like that, and breaking things. And they found in those type of schools that they are children who don't really care about the kind of punishment, and actually using reward was a way of kind of rewarding good behavior, and that was much more successful than punishment. But there's another field of research which is looking at the fact that our brain is quite attuned to trying to learn to do things for a reward, and that might enhance neural plasticity if we think there might be some reward at the end. And it seems, interestingly, the uncertainty about the reward is also quite important. So if you get a reward every time you do something, it becomes less interesting. But if sometimes you get a reward and sometimes you don't, then your brain is sort of a bit more excited by that, and so maybe kind of more attuned to it. So you might not need to give a reward every time, but I think it is kind of, it's just kind of really starting, I think, and teachers can try and explore it. I mean, it's used a lot with younger children, right? Stickers and things like that when they behave well at school, and like charts on the wall. And what do you do in adolescence? I think it's harder. And whether it's things about, you know, competition and sort of ranking in the class, because maybe that, you know, in some way the social interaction is what they care about, you know, that could be explored potentially.
Is there a relation there with how much we might praise people as well, where we keep saying, oh, well done, excellent piece of work, and if you say it too many times, then it doesn't really mean quite so much anymore?
Yeah, I mean, in general, the brain, one key thing the brain does, it habituates, it gets used to things. So if you always get the same thing, then it gets ignored. So in the same way, you know, at the very basic level, if you're in a dark room, you get used to it. You go outside, it's really bright. Initially, you're blinded, and then you get used to it. So our brain constantly adapts to the sort of standard. And yes, if you constantly tell your child, oh, that's great, or your students, that's really awesome, then, you know, what is it? What can you say after that? That's kind of when they really do something better. And they just, you know, might not hear that feedback. So maybe a bit more flexible, adapted feedback is quite constructive feedback, I guess, is maybe more important.
Absolutely. So kind of different gradations, but also what people say as part of the feedback rather than just the grade is the important thing. Thank you. I'll take one last question from the Q&A here before I ask a final question to you. And Lola says, please, how do we deal with media excessiveness in teenagers? Media
excessiveness?
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. But if you think about it, there's interesting things about the fact that over the course of different, you know, historically, people were really worried when books became really cheap and children started reading, they're saying, oh, they're going to be bookworms, they were not going to go outside anymore. And then TV happened, and they were spending hours in front of TV. Now it's kind of mobile phones, and we're spending hours in front of the mobile phones. The problem, I mean, the research suggests that really, you know, it's all about, it's not those are bad in themselves, but it's more what they're displacing. It's like TV. So if you watch TV all the time, you don't go outside and exercise, so going back to your body, and there's physical health is important, or you might not interact with your friends in the same way. So, and there's this effect on sleep potentially, but overall, it doesn't seem that social media has a sort of, or using technology, spending time on technology has a massive detrimental effect. If there are limits, so if you spend more than a number of hours per day, that's kind of a bit more kind of in a sort of clinical, like really detrimental range. But otherwise, it's not kind of intrinsically having massive effects.
And I guess also those who are still looking into this and doing the research on it come from a background where we didn't actually have those kind of devices ourselves. So sometimes it may be difficult for us fully to understand what's going on to some extent. But
yeah, because for example, in terms of social interactions, we think that they might not socially interact, but actually they probably do interact socially a lot via the technology. And that's kind of, in a way, they're adapting to their world, because that's how the world is, and especially with COVID, that's how the world is at the moment. If you're good at, you know, interacting online, you've got good social networks, maybe that's a, you know, a good thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's so many questions here. We could continue on for the same amount of time again, but unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this to an end now. But I want to say thank you to everybody for all of their questions. Just want to ask you one more question then, Iroise, is what do you think we should be researching next in your area of interest? What are the next big lines of inquiry do you think that you've spotted that might be coming up on the horizon?
I think there's so many. I mean, the problem is that we've come up with lots of these different potential tools that might be applied in school. And the question is, you know, is there one that's really better than the other? Is it, what do we really actually need all of them together? Because they all have like a small effect, and together they have, you know, a potentially beneficial effect. But I guess one thing is really, you know, this social component, and how can we use this kind of in a beneficial manner. And I don't know whether a kind of standard classroom format is actually capitalizing on adolescents' interest and strength, or you know, the way they're functioning as much as it could. But it's hard to know what would be, you know, best. I know, for example, Montessori, they have a completely different thing about what they would do in adolescents, actually get them to sort of work and learn by actually doing things, activities, and that, you know, a question about how could you do things a bit differently.
So hey, plenty more to research and plenty for your lab to do, for other people around the world to interact with as well, hopefully. And maybe some of those listening to us today would like to interact with you in some ways on some of these, and with your colleagues as well, to look at international evidence on some of these studies as well, because I'm conscious that sometimes a lot of studies focus in particular areas of the world, whereas we'd very much like for that to be the case across the entire world, of course, as well.
Yes, of course. I mean, that is definitely a negative of the research. How it needs kind of, a lot of it is on these weird population. Yes, I mean, do look at the Center for Educational Neuroscience website. There's a lot of kind of recorded talks or so that you might be interested in, and see kind of a bit what type of research we've been working on.
Absolutely, and I thoroughly recommend. I've had a good look myself, and there's so many good bits and pieces on there. So thank you to you and your colleagues for sharing all those bits and pieces with us as well. So thanks, Iroise. Thanks so much for being with us for the live Q&A today, and for those of you who are watching this recorded, I hope you enjoyed watching it back as well. Apologies to those of you whose questions we couldn't ask, but hopefully you got a good idea of the kind of things you might want to know a bit more about, and you will look back at the presentation and what we just mentioned there, which is on the Birkbeck College and the Centre of Neuroscience websites, and you'll find lots more things there as well that you can perhaps engage with to get your answers to those things too. So thanks to everybody for being part of this. Thanks also to my colleagues, to James, to Lucy, to Kate, to Kirsten, to Jess, and to Julie behind the scenes. You may or may not have seen them on the screen at various points, but they've been doing lots of sterling work behind. So thank you so much to all of them. Just before we leave you, we want to just let you know a bit more about some of the resources that we have on our own website as well. So I don't know whether we can put that, thank you. So you'll see here that we have a couple of resources in particular you might want to engage with. One of them is an education brief on metacognition, which describes some of the theory behind metacognition and then goes into more of the practical ideas as well. And you can see at the bottom of the screen there the link to how you can get to that resource, and the one on the right hand side, which is called Getting Started with Metacognition, which is a really nice resource that you can scroll up, and thank you for putting that in the chat as well. So you can link straight to that and you'll find all sorts there. And also, of course, don't forget that if you are watching this live, or indeed if you're watching it recorded and these are still going on, we have workshops coming up in the next couple of weeks, and many of the things that Iroise has mentioned are going to be picked up upon in those workshops as well. So tune in if you can to those, either live or recorded, because then you can get much more for what you can do in your schools as well. And we hope this has been really useful for you, and those workshops will likewise help you in your ways forward in understanding how the brain works and understanding how you can help students to think more about what they're doing and think more broadly about thinking as well. So Iroise, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you on this. So thank you, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today. And goodbye for now. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, I'm guessing we're no longer live. Am I correct?
We are live. There's I can't toggle off the live, not live, unfortunately.
Okay. getting lots of lovely messages in the chat there, aren't we?
Yes, certainly. We've got lots of people saying it's been really valuable, really interesting session as well. And as James has just said, thanks for that session, really got me thinking as well. And that was indeed the whole purpose of this conference as well. So.
It's spot on. Yep, I was saying thanks for an informative session. Thanks for sharing your research and experiences, Iroise. It's a shame we never get to ask all the questions, unfortunately. We can only ask so many in a session, but I'm hoping we covered most things for everybody there.
Yeah, I think we went across a range there.
Was there anything in the Q&A that you saw, Iroise, that you would have perhaps liked to have answered? I'd avoided some of the areas I thought you would have been less keen to speak about, but I hope I generalised enough in the other ones, but do say.
Well, I guess there were interesting questions about the variability. I mean, how you cope with children with different skills levels, and I think that is a very big challenge for teachers. And in some places there's like streaming, but actually the evidence suggests that streaming is not really beneficial, and that children who are doing well don't do really better, and children who are not doing well and in the lower group do worse. So it doesn't seem that streaming, although it seems that it might make a teacher's life easier, it doesn't actually seem to have beneficial effects. So I think it is a massive challenge how you teach to a wide range of abilities. And I guess, especially in adolescence, this sort of mentorship, like pairing people, like how did you actually, adolescents, some of them might, the good performers could actually then do even better if they mentor someone who is performing less well, because you learn a bit by trying to teach someone else. And the other person might benefit from someone who might explain things a bit different from the teacher and things like that. So I think there are questions, like really practical questions, but how do you deal with that? How do you deal with these mixed abilities in a class? And how do you support? There was one question about some children who might forget or ADHD, but in terms of there are individual differences in work memory, and so children or adolescents with lower work memory skills will find a number of things harder, even things like the teacher giving 4 instructions about 4 things, they just can't keep that in mind. So in those cases, having instructions written on the board or kind of noted down somewhere, that would support that type of kind of adolescents or children who have lower working memory. Mm-hmm. And they might look like they're inattentive, but it might just be because they can't follow, because they've lost track at some point, and then they find it much harder to kind of get back in line because they've lost track of what they were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
What else? I think that's kind of some of the questions I haven't addressed. Yeah, I think how to support the lower ability students, I think it will be very topic specific. And there's also the issue that a lot of school is incremental. So if children haven't mastered reading as fast as their peers, that will affect them in a lot of subjects later on. So it could actually be trying to identify what is really the thing that is impacting and interfering with their learning, and maybe trying to drill into that specifically. So get them to read more if that's really the problem, and that will have an effect on other aspects of the curriculum. If it's concentrating, then might try to think about what is impacting their concentration, because sometimes the conditions at home are not ideal for concentrating. And so thinking about, what can be done for that, whether sometimes like having headphones and or listening to particular types of music, some people find might actually keep them in a sort of better attentive state than others.
Yeah, it's very different. People are different about that. So I personally can't do anything with music on the background, because music to me is like a language, and so therefore it distracts me so much. But I know some other people find the total opposite as well.
Yeah, well, and then I was interested in doing that because I had actually a query from one teacher once saying that the kids in her class, adolescent, they wanted to listen when she was asking them to do something. They were like, "Oh, can I put my headphones? It helps me concentrate." And she was like, "Is that true?" And the problem with this research, I think there's such again, individual differences, but also in your tastes. So I wanted to do that, but I think, for example, comparing adolescents and adults, what music should I play? Because it will be different for different age groups and for different individuals, what they find soothing or distracting or annoying. And I don't think you have that. It will be hard to control.
Too many variables, aren't there, really, I think.
But I think it's also very dependent on the task you're doing. So as you say, if there's language in the song and you're doing language related task, I think that will make it much harder. If you're doing something more like art, then that might not matter as much. But you could listen to classical music that doesn't have language, and that might, actually not interfere. So yeah, I think there's really specific on what task you're doing, what music you'll be listening to.
Yeah, you can experiment, can't you? We're gonna finish off on where we are now. Actually, James is just going to send us a little Teams link so that we can get together quicker there as well, because I think we need to let some of the participants go. And I'll just say to all of them, thank you so much for joining us again. We were doing some after chat here, but you've had some extra insights as well, like a bonus section to the Q&A session. So thanks for continuing to join us. Those of you who are asking about certificates of participation, we don't do that for this, I think I'm correct in saying, but if you do, then that will be arriving to you at some point. But I think it's a case of you're just tuning in, so we can't really prove what you've done here in a sense other than just listen in. So no, nothing for that for you, I'm afraid. But anyway, we're going to finish here on this channel. So thanks again to everybody. Bye for now.